About something I think that all of us at one time or another have had struggle. And actually it comes in two parts: envy and jealousy. Now we tend to combine those two words to mean the same thing in our modern vernacular as we talk to people. But in fact, those two things are actually quite different from one another. Envy is the desire we have for something that another possesses. Jealousy, on the other hand, is a desire to keep others from that which we have. And so those are two ends of the same type of idea. And let me say this: jealousy, God is jealous over his people. A husband can be jealous over his wife. A wife can be jealous over her husband. She doesn't want anybody else in that relationship, right? He doesn't want anybody else in that relationship. God doesn't want us to have any other gods before him. He's jealous over us, and Paul said, with a godly jealousy. So you can have jealousy not be evil, but envy is always, always, always evil. When it comes to envy, we're told not to covet our neighbor's possessions. At the heart of envy is covetousness. What is envy then? Well, etymologically, the word means to look against, to eye with evil intent. I want you to keep that definition in mind because it's closely akin to what happens when we're also jealous of somebody. All right? The dictionary states that envy is the discontent at the excellence or good fortune of another. And then the Bible uses this word also in ways to describe what we would term or note as malice or spite. Okay? Envy is that uncomfortable feeling that we experience over the advances or advantages or the good fortune of somebody else. An envious person feels that any honor that somebody else is receiving is a robbing of something from them. Rachel envied Leah because she was barren, and Leah was the mother of several children, Genesis 30 and verse 1. Here's somebody who has several children, but she becomes envious over her sister for having conceived a child. You say, well, okay, what does that have to do with me? Well, let's put it in a modern term. So you're perfectly content and happy in your A-frame 3-bedroom home, but then your neighbor, your buddy, your friend, your compadre sells his home and buys a tri-level 5-bedroom home with 3 bathrooms and a 2-car garage. All of a sudden, I'm no longer as content in my A-frame 3-bedroom home, right? But let's break it down even more. I've been content with my old Chevy. My Chevy's run good, things have been well, but then my neighbor buys a BMW and drives his Beamer up the driveway. All right. Sometimes we tend to get a little envious of the good fortune or the possessions of somebody else, right? The envy one sees in others is oftentimes neglected in their own eyes regarding themselves. I think about Saul, and that's who we're going to talk about this morning. As we think about Saul, you read through the book of 1 Samuel, that is Saul's story. The entire book of 1 Samuel is Saul's story. And there's a lot that's said about Saul in that particular book. I think about Israel. It actually begins with Israel. Saul's story begins with Israel, 1 Samuel chapter 8. They sought changes in what God had provided. God had always been their king, but now they began, after the period of the judges, which was also another problem with them, they failed to recognize and honor God as king and serve him as they should have. And so what happened was God brought them into captivity. They would cry out under the oppression of captivity. God would deliver them with a judge, and then the cycle would begin again, where they'd be faithful to God, fall away from God, be captive, cry out to God, and be delivered by another judge. And so that period of the judges, constant changes within Israel as they were oppressed and taken into captivity by others. And so they finally said to Samuel, up, make us a king, like the nations round about us. They wanted a king to oversee them. They couldn't see the problem was themselves. But God had already directed them as to what a king would be if they should ever choose one. And so the book of Deuteronomy bears that out. Samuel said, God, they rejected me from being their judge. They rejected me. And what did God tell him? They've not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. And so God gives them the wish of having a king, listen to the term, like the nations round about them. And so God chose Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. Keep that in mind. I think sometimes we wonder, David was of the tribe of Judah, so God made David king after Saul. Why didn't God just start out with the tribe of Judah? They wanted a king, listen again, like the nations around about them. Saul was from the warring tribe. Benjamin was known for its ability to be vengeful. It was known for its ability to be violent as a tribe. They wanted a king like the nations around about them. In 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1, there was a man of the Benjamites whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeor, the son of Bechariah. Great names, by the way, if you want some for grandchildren and children. The son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. He had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among all the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Y'all getting a picture? Here's the most handsome, the tallest, strongest representation Israel has, like the nations round about them. Saul had every advantage when God chose him, brethren. He could have been a great king, but as the old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. You see, King Saul had a lack of respect for worship. In 1 Samuel 13, what did he do? God's law stated who the priest was and the priestly tribe and what they were doing and what their duties were. He wouldn't wait for the priest to come back. Instead, he got frightened. The people got frightened. He got frightened. He offered up sacrifices before God like a priest, and he was rebuked for it. In 1 Samuel 14, he showed an extreme lack of judgment. He made a foolish oath not to eat before the battle. And this lack of judgment would have led to the death of his own son, had he followed through and not been convinced by the priest not to do it. King Saul disobeyed God's instructions. In 1 Samuel 15, God says, when you go down to the Amalekites, you destroy them utterly. Don't leave anyone living. Don't take of anything they have. Destroy it all. Well, we know that when he went down there, he left King Agag alive. Another great name, by the way, for kids. You want your kid to stand out at school. Agag is a good name. And then brought back cattle from the battle. In fact, he said, I've done what the Lord said I should do. Do you remember what the prophet said? What then is this lowing of the oxen in my ear? Why do I hear, if you've done what God told you to do, why do I hear cows out there bellowing? King Saul battled with self-deception. In chapters 13 and 15, when he was asked about why he did what he did, he said, I feared the people. I did what the people wanted me to do. The people did what they wanted to do. Listen to that excuse making. And like many of the kings of the time, he wanted to be seen as a good king in the sight of the people. Listen, you do what God tells you to do, and you lead the people in what is righteous and true, you'll have the respect of the people. He chose rather to try to gain their respect by giving in to their wants and whims and needs. Does that sound like modern day politics to you? Yep. Ultimately, King Saul was unfaithful to God. You know, when Samuel died, he got so discouraged over his situation, he didn't know what was going to happen. He's going into battle. He wanted to find out what's going to happen. God wasn't talking to him anymore. So he goes down to a witch in Endor, a necromancer, somebody who brings up dead spirits, right? And so, by the way, I think that gal, she probably was pretty much a fake up until the time of Samuel, because when Samuel came out, she didn't know what to think. She was frightened when Samuel came out. And old Saul says, what's he wearing? What's he like? Tell me about him. When she gave the description, she said, oh, that's him. Samuel says, why did you disturb me from my slumber, my rest? He said, I want to know if I go into battle, am I going to die? And so Samuel rebukes him again and then tells him, you know what's going to happen? You're going to die there. Your son's going to die there. That's what's going to happen. He told him his end. All because he was completely, utterly unfaithful to God. Couched in the midst of all this tragic fall of Saul is his pursuit of David. The first hint of envy with David is interesting. You recall, as we read 1 Samuel, that David took on Goliath. Remember that? He took on Goliath. But I want you to realize that when he took on Goliath, he set himself up for the praise of the people. And do you remember what I told you about jealousy? Jealousy is I'm guarding what I have. God already told Saul it's going to go away. Could you imagine the paranoia in his mind, wondering to himself, when is this going to happen? How is this going to happen? Who's it going to be that's going to take my place? I think he started having hints of that when David took on Goliath and won. The Bible tells us that when he overcame Goliath, that Saul began to use him, and David went out wherever Saul sent him. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 6. And he behaved wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened when they were coming home, David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women could come out from all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet the king, right? With tambourines, with joy and musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced. Listen to what they said. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Imagine what David was thinking at this point, what Saul was thinking. Had David done anything to cause these people? He called on the women to sing such praises to him? Absolutely not. But the Bible tells us what happened with Saul. He was very angry and displeased at him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. What did we describe envy as? To eye over. Here he is eyeing out David. And from that time forward, Saul sought to take David's life. I think there are some lessons we can learn from him in that life story. We can learn, number one, even the most humble can be tempted. You know, when we meet Saul, he's described as a very humble individual. It's said that he was a choice young man, handsome. There was not a more handsome person among all the children of Israel. But I want you to notice his own assessment of himself. In chapter 9 and verse 21, when he was called by the prophet to come and to be the king as God appointed him to be, he said, am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me? Here's somebody who understood in his own eyes just how little he was. And he's wondering, why would God choose me for this? You know, sometimes we start out with the humblest of beginnings. We realize how truly helpless we are in the sight of God. How blessed we are that God is willing to exalt us up. But the problem with Saul, it wouldn't be long before the people were standing before him and shouting, God save the king, right? 1 Samuel 10:24. All of a sudden, the next thing you know, he's getting the exalted position in his own mind. We have the benefit of looking back over Saul's life. I wonder if Saul had known all that would transpire following that if he'd have made the same choices. And brethren, let me ask you this. The choices that we make, do they have consequence? Do you know your choices make you? For good or ill. Saul's choices all made him. What does James tell us to do in James 4:10? But to humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. One of Saul's problems was God was exalting him, but he was seeking the exaltation of the people. We're told to strive to remain humble and content. If we don't, brethren, we're going to find ourselves right in the shoes of Saul. We'll find ourselves as someone who starts out humble, but then is tempted. I think number two, we can learn that even the most humble can become haughty. It didn't take Saul that long. It's intoxicating to hear people cry out your name, right? I can't imagine what it's like for these politicians we got. Harris, 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 Trump, Trump, Trump. You know these rallies they have, everybody's calling out their name. Everybody, they begin to think that everybody thinks like the folks in the audience do. It's easy to start ascribing yourself a place in a position that's not warranted. I'll tell you from the preacher's perspective. Sometimes the preacher can get exalted beyond measure, right? Everybody's talking to the preacher, starts to feel somewhat important in the congregation. You've got to be careful with that as a preacher. You become a deacon or an elder in the church, you've got to be careful of that. Bible class teacher, you've got to be careful of that. Somebody who works with benevolence, got to be careful of that. somebody who's caring and kind over their neighbors. See, all of these things can find their way to exalt us if we're not careful. We're to let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father who's in heaven, right? You see, we can learn even the most humble can be haughty. And it didn't take Saul long. They wanted a king like the nations around about them. He's handsome, he's tall, he's strong, he's from that warring tribe. What happened to Saul? Well, he offered sacrifice when he shouldn't have. He failed to utterly destroy the Amalekites and saving Agag alive, 1 Samuel 15. Samuel nailed the problem. You go to chapter 15 and verse 17. It's interesting what Samuel said to him. When you, talking to Saul, when you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you as king over Israel? That is such a great piece of advice, isn't it? Learning to keep yourself little in your eyes and let God do the work of exaltation. When he humbled himself, the Lord exalted him. But Saul had another problem as well. He failed to take responsibility. When God told him to utterly drive out the Amalekites and to kill them and he took that responsibility, but then he didn't follow through. And he wouldn't take responsibility for his failure. In 1 Samuel 15 and verse 20, Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission which the Lord sent me and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. Wait a minute, you didn't do it? I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites, but the people took the plunder, the sheep and the oxen, the best of which was to be utterly destroyed. But they did it, listen, they did it to sacrifice unto the Lord at Gilgal. You know, it's okay as long as we do it to sacrifice. It's okay to disobey God as long as we're doing it to sacrifice to Him. That's not what God told him to do. What was the result of his haughtiness? His life grew more and more stressful. You ever got to a point where David had to come in and play the harp for him? Remember that? His first introduction to David. Because when David would play the harp, right, he'd have peace. He found out that God chose David to be the next king. In fact, chapter 16 and verse 14, God sent an evil spirit to Saul. Sometimes folks say, man, I feel like the demons are haunting me. Maybe we need to look at our life a little closer and find out where our humility is or isn't. And ultimately, Saul would perish as a result of his sinfulness, his envy, and his rebellion. I think there's a third lesson that can be learned here. We can learn how haughtiness can lead to hostility or jealousy, as we talked about. Saul's envy and suspicion grew after David's triumph over Goliath, and David had nothing to do with it, right? It became evident to Saul that David is now a competitor for the throne. His mistake was thinking that David was just like him. He thought, surely David will see his conquest, he'll see the people love him, and he will try to get rid of me. That's what Saul would do. That's not what David would do. In fact, don't we read as David is being pursued by Saul, there were occasions where David could have taken the life of Saul and ended the problem of being pursued? And yet David, when his men came to him and said, let's go kill him. He's sleeping. Let's go kill him. David said, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. David's point, it's not my place to kill him. That's between him and God. Interestingly, he finds a time to sneak down when Saul's sleeping, right? And he steals some things and brings them back. And the next day, he reminds Saul, listen, I was down there. I could have taken your life. I didn't. Do you know that he even apologized for that? He felt ashamed that he went down there and embarrassed the king, even after all the king had done to him that was evil. Here's Saul's envy, his suspicion. We find his homicidal hostility borne out in a couple of ways. In chapter 18, we find, first, I plan to kill him myself. What did he do? David came in and he hurled a spear at him. I will pin David to the wall, he said. But David escaped. So on to plan B. I'll let the Philistines kill him. Right? So you get to chapter 18, verses 17 through 19. And so Saul says, listen, my older daughter Merab, I'll give her to you to wife if you go down there and fight the Philistines. He thought to himself, listen, let my hand not be against David, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. Sounds a lot like some other events we find in the scripture, right? Don't want my hands bloody, so I just let this thing carry out. Uriah the Hittite sound familiar? Even in David's life? I wonder where he got the idea. A second time, he goes down and battles, and he is promised this woman, doesn't get her. Right? He goes down and fights, doesn't get her. He comes back, Saul says, listen, what I'll do, he said, I'll go ahead and give you my daughter, Michal. But you got to go down and get 100 foreskins of the Philistines. You got to fight them, bring them back to me, and show me that you've gone to battle for me. You know what David did now? He went down there and killed 200 of the rascals. Why? Because David loved Saul. He thought it an honor to be Saul's son-in-law. Right? You know what that did? It caused the people to give more praise to him and become more precious in the eyes of Israel than before. Chapter 18 and verse 30. Also caused Saul to be more afraid of David than he had ever been. So he goes to plan C. I know what I'll do. I'll convince my son, listen, if we don't kill David, you'll never be king. Imagine that. A father calling on his son to violate Exodus chapter 20, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. Trying to convince his own son to do the dirty deed of murdering David. Right? But the Bible tells us that his son would not hear his father's arguments, that David was precious in the sight of Jonathan, right? So Saul hears his son's arguments, says, all right, I'll welcome him back in. You know, that would have been a great story of repentance right there. He welcomes David back into his presence, all things are well. But, again, he's battling the Philistines, he's winning. David's name is once again on the lips of the people, right? And so what does Saul do? He gets angry again. And the hunt is on. David's pursued. And Saul's own envy consumed him to the point that he finally died as a result. God had departed from him. David's help against Israel's enemies was not Saul's to have anymore. Both he and his son Jonathan die in battle. And David is appointed king. All because of his envy. All because of his jealous rage. So, what are some thoughts for us? What can we derive from this example of envy? I think first and foremost we see that envy always brings great havoc and grief. It does. You think about Cain. He murdered his own brother because of envy, 1 John 3:12. God tells us it was envy in the heart of Cain that caused him to murder his own brother. Because of envy, the Philistines stopped up Isaac's wells, Genesis 26. Because of envy, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, Genesis 37. Right? Because of envy, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram rebelled against Moses in the wilderness. What happened? The ground opened up, swallowed them. But not before they got a large number of Israelites to follow after them. Because of envy, our Lord was handed over to be crucified, Mark 15:10. It was for envy they crucified him. And it's because of envy that Saul ruined his life and cost Israel the peace and prosperity it could have had during the years that he was king. Because what was he doing? Pursuing David instead. Brethren, what is our envy doing to the Lord's work today? What happens to the Lord's work right here in Rogers City without envy and jealousy in among us? We start envying and being jealous over one another. We start envying the world and the things it's got. You see, the envious have no good future. What happened to Saul? When we read that event, his peace was removed. He was at war within himself. He was at war within himself long before he was at war with David or war with anybody else. His purpose in Israel was taken from him. He was God's appointed man. He had an amazing future, could have had a great legacy of being faithful to God, but allowed his envy and his jealousy to drive him to do evil. And ultimately his life was taken from him in battle because of his envy and jealousy. Looking back over Cain, the Philistines, Joseph's brethren, Korah and his kindred, what was therein? What happened to each one of them as a result of their envy? And brethren, I'll say this, it'll be the same concerning us, if we're not careful to guard our hearts against envy. We should rejoice with those who rejoice. Romans 12:15. I should not be envious of my brother or my sister because they've gained great fame, because they have money, because they've accomplished great things, because they've been exalted in the church to positions of leadership. There should never be a time when I look at my brother or sister and I'm envious of them because of the accomplishments that they have and God's exaltation of them in their position. Never. If another is exalted, we should praise God and thank Him for the blessing of another person having the opportunity to serve Him in greater ways. God knows what He's doing, brethren. I don't, but God does. We should be like David. I love the fact that the Holy Spirit had all this recorded for us, so that we can learn from David. We can learn from Saul. I don't want to be like Saul. I do want to be like David when David was being pursued by Saul. I want to be like David. Do you remember how David responded to the news as you come to the close of 1 Samuel and get into 2 Samuel 1? Do you remember how David responded to the news of Saul's death? He was heartbroken. He loved Saul. By the way, it wasn't the case that Saul wasn't loved. Samuel himself loved Saul. He was a loved man, but his envy and his jealousy destroyed him. In fact, David defended Saul as the Lord's anointed, his appointed one, and he held a man accountable. Do you remember, you get into 1 Samuel, the last chapter, tells us that when Saul was killed, he turned to his armor bearer and said, "Slay me." And so he did, and he fell on his sword, right? And you get to 2 Samuel, and you'll read where a man came upon him, and seeing what was done, took his bracelet, signet, comes back to David, and then he tells David, "You know what I did? I killed Saul. I did that." He thought he was going to be exalted, right? David's enemies destroyed. Do you remember what David did? He said, "You've spoken to your own death." Why? You raised your hand against the Lord's anointed. Something David himself did not do, would not do. Was it true that this man had killed Saul? I don't believe so. But he spoke that he did, and he took upon him something that was not an honorable thing to do. And David had him slain as a result of it. In fact, interestingly, David led the party to go retrieve the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and to give them a proper burial. Think about that. How many of us would do something like that for somebody who pursued us and sought our destruction? And then to honor them. Could we do the same, brethren? I think there's another lesson here in history. Sometimes when I'm preparing for my sermon in the morning, I'll go back over my notes and I'll rearrange things. And for some reason, this one struck me funny this morning. I thought, this is interesting. Absolute power corrupted Saul, absolutely. But David had problems with pride after he became king. Solomon had problems with pride after he became king, right? What was it that divided the kingdom? You see, all of these problems that these kings had were because they were all men. What was God proving in allowing Israel to have a king? You should have kept me as your king all along. Rather be careful with that. Be careful with the envy about what happens with others, and you look at God as somehow failing in giving you all that you want, so you put your faith and your trust in a person. Be it a preacher, an elder, a deacon, somebody in the workplace, whatever it might be. Men are fallible, God is not. And in all of this, I think we learn some tremendous truths. The way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. They thought by having a king like the nations around about them, they'd have peace. They had far from it. And that's why Jesus is called the Prince of Peace. You see, we got a king back again, and his name is Jesus. We notice that there is indeed a distinction between jealousy and envy, but they are opposite ends of the same stick, if you will. We envy others in wanting what they possess. Even though we're told in Exodus 20, you have to covet your neighbor's house, his wife, his servant, his ox, his donkey. I don't know how many of you are envying or desiring or coveting somebody's ox or donkey, maybe so, but you ought not to desire or want his Cadillac, right? His Harley Davidson. See, sometimes we get caught up, their house. We get caught up in covetousness and envy. In contrast, jealousy is the fear that something we possess is going to be taken away. You know what Jesus said? He said, if you're asked to go a mile, compelled to go a mile, you go 2. If that man wants your coat, give him your cloak. Brethren, I got the idea the Lord wasn't concerned about the material things we possess. I've loaned things that never came back to me. You ever had that happen? All of us, one time or another. I loaned it anyway. It didn't stop me from loaning out to other people after that. Lord always provided a way for me to replace whatever was taken away. Sometimes I loaned it out, forgot all about it. You ever do that? So you need it? Like 3 years later, I know that thing's around here somewhere. Listen, both of those things, envy and jealousy, were Saul's downfall. And brethren, I think it's important for us to take lessons from him. I've been preaching long enough to notice something else that I thought of this morning. I've been preaching long enough to have seen preacheritis. And you say, what's preacheritis? Well, we tend to think of preacheritis like 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where I am of Paul, and I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Apollos, and I'm of Christ, right? Paul says, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Preacheritis sometimes finds its form in people putting their trust and their faith in the preacher. But I've also seen preacheritis in this way. Preachers who look at other preachers and their successes and they become envious of what the other preacher's done. And in 3 decades of preaching, brethren, I've noticed one thing. Lighthouses never compete. They just don't. Lighthouses don't compete. Preachers ought not to be envious one of another, and I've striven in my preaching not to allow that to happen to me. Andrew Bonaire said this day 20 years ago, I preached for the first time as an ordained minister. It is amazing that the Lord has spared me and used me at all. I have no reason to wonder that he used others far more than he does me, yet envy is my hurt. And today I've been seeking grace to rejoice exceedingly over the usefulness of others, even where it casts me into the shade. Lord, take this envy from me. A poet has written, I love a thing that's fine, even when it's not mine. And though it never mine can be, yet it delights and gladdens me. I think to myself, am I going to be like Mr. Bonaire and not allow myself to be envious of any other? Or am I going to allow envy to find its way in and be like Saul, who ultimately destroyed himself? Brethren, envy will burn you down. Jealousy will burn you down. It will destroy everything good in your life. It will cause you to be discontent. You'll have no peace. You'll never find your purpose in the kingdom. You'll never fulfill it because you'll get distracted as Saul did pursuing David rather than doing what God told him to do in the first place. He could have repented, brethren. Never let that escape the mind. At any point, he could have said, God, forgive me. Your will be done. If that meant he's no longer king, he's no longer king. Let God do what God does. But Saul wasn't willing to let that happen, and he got sidetracked, and it destroyed the work he could have done, and it brought distress to everybody else. Let us be not like Saul. Let us be like Mr. Bonaire and ask God, take this envy from me. Don't let me be envious of others. Let me be the person you'd have me to be in the kingdom at this time. We have an invitation song picked out. We do this because we want to extend an opportunity for someone who's never obeyed the gospel to do so if they want to. We also provide this opportunity for us to have prayers for one another if we're struggling with some sin. We confess our faults one to another, pray for one another. We sing number 667. We're going to sing the first and last verse. If you have a need this morning, won't you come while together we stand and sing?